am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, episode 7, Battle of Kosovo and the End of the Road for Sultan Murad. News and updates from this episode hence will now be moved to the back end of the show. Let's jump right in. In episode 6, we left Sultan Murad I in Anatolia, dealing with the Karamanids, when he learned of a massive Ottoman defeat in Bosnia. News of this defeat sent the Sultan into Europe to make war and expand the empire. But, due to time constraints, we never really got to cover the actual battle itself that was the catalyst to so much to follow. The Battle of Belica, as it's called, took place in 1388 in the Kingdom of Bosnia. It's pretty significant because, as I explained in episode 6, the defeat of the Ottomans rallied most of the regional Christian leaders against the Ottomans, under the leadership of a Serbian nobleman named Lazar. Now the Slavs and other Balkan people had rallied before. Once when the Ottomans occupied Gallipoli under Oran, another time after the Battle of Chernobyl, and the historical record indicates sporadic resistance to Ottoman raids and the various bulls issued by popes attempting to declare another crusade. Crusades which always seem to go unheeded by the divided Orthodox East and very suspicious Catholic West. However, most of these cries for rallying and uniting against the invading Turks were always on the heel of some great Ottoman victory. It is therefore not surprising that the calls to crusade fell on deaf ears when the survivors limped home, and the Ottoman Akimchi, the irregular raiders, burned farms and looted at will. Most regional rulers saw it best to become vassals of the Sultan, or cede him land, then unite and start a war they'd surely lose. But after the Battle of Belica, Sultan Murad watched the Slavic lords unite in a manner they'd never united before, and seemed to be under solid leadership. This, as you can imagine, was of grave concern for the Ottomans. Although the Ottomans had, under Sultan Murad, secured massive swaths of territory and fortresses along the border with Serbia and Bulgaria, a swift advance of an enemy army had the chance of swooping up these fortified positions before the Sultan could arrive with his men. This means the last strategically defensible positions the Ottomans could occupy was way back in southern Macedonia and even to the shores of the Dardanelles, not a situation Murad wanted to face. Before we get any further then, it's helpful to take a look at the Battle of Belica and how it unfolded. As I said, Sultan Murad was away in Anatolia fighting the Karamanids and attempting to bring them under his boot. But while he was away from Europe, the conquering and raiding didn't just stop. The Sultan had left local subordinate commanders to carry the fire of the Gazas to the Christians. One of these commanders who had appeared before us during the Battle of Chernobyl was Lalu Pasha. Lalu Pasha was busy pressing into Serbia with raids intent on carrying away loot. And by loot, I mean horses, anything of value, and sadly enough, human chattel to be sold in the Arabian slave markets. While mounting raids into Serbia, the Serbs seem to have been helped by Duke Vukovic of the Kingdom of Bosnia. The Duke had been eyeing Ottoman incursions into Serbia for some time, but had so far refrained from aiding his Christian neighbors because he, along with other nobles, thought the Ottomans were simply too far away to be any real threat. However, during a deep penetrating raid that took an Ottoman force all the way into the heart of Bosnia, the Duke woke up to the threat. This returning Ottoman raiding force, the leader of which is unknown, reported to Lalu sometime in 1387 that Bosnia might be a soft target of sorts. After Lalu's men clashed with Duke Vukovic's forces in northern Serbia, Lalu resolved to prove to the Bosnians that the Ottomans were closer than he thought. In mid-1388, Lalu led a force of Ottomans into Bosnia. Now, in episode 6, I said we didn't have exact figures or numbers, and there is a small amount of controversy on this topic among historians. Some take the position the Ottoman force was a medium-sized raiding force cut down by the Bosnians. Others maintain that it was in actual fact a large army, and later Ottoman recorders wish this fact to be concealed. I'll leave it to those who have written PhD and dissertations on the subject to sort through the muss. However, my own very amateurish opinion is that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It probably wasn't a full army, and wasn't no small raiding party either. The Duke is reported to have had between 5,000 and 10,000 men, so we can assume the Ottomans had somewhere thereabouts as well. Lalu marched with his Ottoman force into Bosnia to raid and plunder to his heart's delight. When he entered the southern portion of Bosnia, no significant amount of resistance was encountered. This led to an uncommon relaxing of discipline in Lalu's camp, as his forces spread out to feast on the fat of the land as they plundered small towns and carried off their inhabitants. Keeping careful track of Ottoman movements were the light scouts of Duke Vukovic, who reported the positions of the enemy to their master. Quickly mobilizing what men he had on hand, the Duke deployed them in the northern part of the kingdom and away from the Ottoman forces who had collected in the south. While en route to their waypoint, the Duke's forces evacuated whole cities and towns, and then took up strong preset ambush positions in the mountains and gorges, and then simply waited for the Ottomans. When news that the Duke was mobilizing reached Lalu, he had no small amount of difficulty in assembling his force, allowing the Duke time to fully mobilize and set up in the north. Lalu then proceeded, very slowly, on a forced march, with his army laden with captured locals and treasure. This meant most of his forces were spread out along the baggage train to help guard their loot and not focused at the front as they should have been. The great Ottoman advantage had always been speed and surprise and supreme intelligence, but this was now negated with the lax discipline, slow-moving force, and the Ottomans' every move trailed by the Duke's scouts. Arriving in the north of Bosnia, Lalu stopped and assessed the situation, where he was forced to come to some rather grim conclusions. On the one hand, the Duke was practically dug in to the deep gorges and mountains in incredibly tough-to-break positions. If he attacked, he'd suffer huge casualties, and he risked losing all the loot they'd gained in the first place. The only sensible option, from strictly a military point of view, would have been to abandon the loot and head south at full speed and back into Ottoman territory. Then regroup, head back out with a larger force, one capable of taking on the Serbians and Bosnians. But Lalu knew if he abandoned the loot to his troops, they would likely mutiny and then appoint another commander. And when the troops mutinied and appointed another commander, what exactly happened to the old one? He was forced then to choose the lesser of two evils, and he chose to attack the positions. Needless to say, after nearly 2 days of fighting, the Ottomans were driven back with heavy casualties. While in his tent on the second day of battle, trying to come up with a plan to get himself out of the situation, the Duke sprung out of his ambush positions for a full-on assault on the Ottoman camp. The Ottomans and Lalu were caught completely by surprise by the size and speed of the attacking Bosnians, and the Ottomans attempted a grand final stand, but this group was broken up by the lances of the Bosnian knights. Soon, it no longer mattered what happened to the baggage train or their loot. It was every man for himself, and Lalu barely managed to make it back to Ottoman territory with his life and live to tell the tale. Most of the Ottoman force was annihilated and cut down as they tried to make a run for it out of Bosnia. These movements and engagements in subsequent Bosnian victory are known as the Battle of Belica. Fast forward to about the end of the year in 1388. Sultan Murad had arrived from Europe and heard, in person from Lalu, the details of the defeat. And rumor was getting around that the Ottoman defeat was actually due to the treachery of that pesky ally the Sultan had once helped, Lazar of Serbia. The Sultan summoned his army and managed to muster some 25,000 troops. Murad set out to first settle matters with Bulgaria, of which the northern portion of the country especially had managed to retain independence in order to secure his flank. The Sultan marched into northern Bulgaria practically unopposed and annexed it, and set his efficient administration to the task of assimilating the people and resources into the empire immediately while he was still on the march. Fleeing the Sultan was Bulgaria's fearless ruler, Prince Lazar, who had sworn to defend his kingdom to the last drop of his blood. The fearless prince, and indeed, dear listeners, that was his actual name, Fearless Prince, had sought refuge in a mighty fortress situated on the Danube River and declared to have a last stand. The Ottomans, however, dispassionately brought up expert Greek engineers who promptly brought down the fortress walls, and the prince surrendered without further fight and agreed to swear fealty to the Sultan, and seeing that his after-mentioned kingdom was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Feeling satisfied that the Bulgarians were reduced to servitude and firmly within the empire, the Sultan set out for Serbia, intent on finding and killing Lazar. By the time the Sultan reached a place known as the Plain of the Blackbirds, which was and still is today a desolate and isolated mountain plain, often shrouded in mist like a scene from Lord of the Rings, Murad was 70 years old. Realizing that this may be his one last great battle, the Sultan chose to not leave anything up to chance and carefully planned and deployed his army. The Plain of the Blackbirds is something of a national monument in Serbia today, as it's really the starting point of what we would recognize as the mythic beginnings of Serbian nationalism. The terrible day when the Serbian nation would face its worst defeat since the Nazi leader and later Soviet invasions in World War II. The plain is situated at a point where the frontiers of Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania all converge. It seems in studying history, there exists a kind of black irony at times, as this area was also the scene of great bloodshed after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and later Yugoslav Republic and the creation of the modern nation-states that we have today in the Balkans. With dusk approaching on June the 14th, 1389, Sultan Murad ordered the tents pitched. The Ottomans spread their tents out into interlocking figures, creating a kind of cable and wires of death maze to anyone attempting to force their way past the choke points. Within the Sultan's magnificent and grand tent, and also guarded by 2,000 of his hardcore janissaries, Murad sat by himself, brooding. A terrible melancholy seemed to have overtaken him, the sources report. A low and thick fog had descended upon the future battlefield, and the Sultan and his commanders worried that it would work to the Serbians' advantage. It is said that the Sultan didn't sleep the night before the battle, but instead he stayed up praying aloud God would clear the fog by morning. He even remarked that if a man were to die, it was best to die in the service of God and go out as a martyr. The Sultan had reasons to worry. Opposing him was Prince Lazar of Serbia, along with a coalition of troops supplied by Croatians, Bulgarians, Albanians, a few Hungarian, and even Wallachian forces. So great this number that Ottoman historians of the time record their number as some 35,000 men strong, which would make the Plain of the Blackbirds one of the very few instances where Christian Europe outnumbered the Ottomans in a battle. However, what the Sultan's spies had failed to report was that all wasn't green on the other side after all. As I've said before, a common tactic of the Sultans when faced with a coalition of Christians was to simply hold back and wait, all the while knowing Christian alliances often broke down into infighting and pointless bickering, and this seemed to be what was happening inside the Christian camp. All night, subordinate commanders argued constantly over who would get to lead this or that charge, how the loot should be split up, and what would happen after the victory. They were all pretty sure would be theirs. Sometime during this bickering and stupid petty jealousies, there arose a rumor that Lazar's son-in-law, a nobleman named Milosh, was plotting to defect to the Ottomans during the battle. This fear wasn't exactly unfounded, as the Sultan had a habit before a big fight to send in spies with promises of riches, lands, and titles to any commander who would serve the Sultan, and we can't doubt that Murad would have attempted to pull off something in this case. Whether or not it was Milosh the Ottomans had gotten to, the Christian force couldn't really say at the time. At any rate, Prince Lazar, during a particularly heated argument with his commanders, publicly called out Milosh in front of an assembly of his peers and noblemen and accused him of treachery. The humiliated and angry Milosh fervently denied any secret Ottoman alliance for hours on end, till at last Prince Lazar relented and regulated Milosh to a non-important military role in the rear for the next day's battle. It should be noted that the assembly had been called by Lazar with the intention of delivering an epic motivational speech that would inspire his men, but had instead degraded into a madman's tirade against his son-in-law. Early the next morning the fog had lifted, much to Sultan Murad and his generals' delight. The Ottomans took up the field in what was now becoming typical fashion. The Sultan, with his advance heavy cavalry guard, drawn up in front and backed by the iron janissaries. His right flank was covered by his eldest son and future Sultan himself, Bayezid, commanding the well-trained European troops. The Sultan's left flank was led by his other son, Yaqub, who commanded the Turkish Anatolian troops. Ordering an advance guard of archers to move forward, the Sultan opened the battle with a volley of these deadly marksmen. Retaliating against the archery volley, 3,000 mounted Christian knights plowed through the Ottoman left flank. So sudden was their charge that Yaqub had no time to order his lines drawn up to counter the charge with lances, and the knights drove straight into his ranks, and within 20 minutes completely managed to break up the Ottoman left flank. This was the most crucial point in the battle. When one of a medieval's army's flank is turned or scattered, it opens the back of the army up, the one not facing the enemy, to an attack from the rear. When this happens on a battlefield, soldiers, only seeing what is directly in front of them, will panic and run 99% of the time, if suddenly and without warning attacked from behind. Thus, when Yaqub's flank scattered, the Serbians were presented with an opportunity to attack the Ottoman rear and perhaps win the day. However, Bayezid, commanding the right wing, on his own initiative broke off a force of men and led them in person to the left flank, and effectively counterattacked the knights, driving them off. This single act of bravery by one man, and the eldest of Sultan Murad's sons, and future Ottoman Sultan, as I said earlier, is what stabilized the line and saved the Ottomans from disaster. During the next couple of hours, the battle lines ebbed and flowed on either side, with charges met by countercharges and more attempts by Turkish cavalry and Christian knights to turn the flanks of their enemy. Remember what I said earlier about how Prince Lazar accused his son-in-law of treachery? Well, we can pretty much be sure it wasn't poor old Milosh after all. Because during the battle, when things were still very much in doubt for the Ottomans, a Serbian lord named Brankovic withdrew 12,000 of his troops from the battlefield and simply marched them off. It seems though in the end, Sultan Murad's old trick worked again. In researching this part of the battle, I can only picture the scene from Braveheart, with Mel Gibson's character signaling the Scottish lords to back him against King Edward's army. Then the look on his face as the lords turned and marched away. The look that says, "Oh my dear God, we are doomed." But it wasn't just Lazar who watched Brankovich's forces march away and despaired, but Miloš watched the spectacle as well. Pretty soon, both sides drew up in tight defensive positions, and the Serbians prepared for an all-out final push to give their army time to escape the field, hopefully regroup and fight another day. Miloš, though, still probably reeling from the dressing down he'd received from his father-in-law the night before, saw a golden opportunity to prove his loyalty to Lazar and also perhaps save the day. Thus Miloš, with a small group of fellow nobles, galloped away from Lazar's line and headed for the Ottomans, not with the intent of attacking, but on the surface to defect. Now, I know what you're thinking about Miloš, but let's hold on and let's see what happens. Miloš, along with his nobles, some 10 men we are told, were immediately taken into custody by the Ottomans. Miloš, being a prince of the realm, possessed enough rank to demand and was granted an audience with the Sultan. Miloš was brought into Murad's tent, where he was ordered to submit to the Sultan's authority, which involved kneeling and kissing the Sultan's hand. The Janissaries guarding the Sultan had seen such scenes played out 100 times before. Defeated or defected princes pays homage to their Sultan. Prince then leaves, everyone goes home happy. So we can't really blame Murad's bodyguards. When the 1 out of 100 times an incident occurred under their watch and they were caught napping. Kneeling before the Sultan, Miloš made a huge show of bowing close to the ground, when suddenly his nobles rushed Murad's bodyguards, and while occupied, Miloš leaped up from his kneeling position and stabbed the old Sultan repeatedly with a hidden dagger. It is said Miloš and his men fought on for a few minutes, before finally the tent was rushed with soldiers who literally hacked them to pieces. While bleeding out, the Sultan issued his last order for the reserve cavalry to move forward and slay to the man the entire Christian army. He furthermore ordered that Lazar, when captured, was to be tortured and then executed. Miloš, by his action and wishing to prove his loyalty and win the day for the Serbians, ultimately sealed Lazar's doom. The death of Sultan Murad in 1389 seemed like a cruel joke. But then again, fate, the universe, or whatever you call it, seems to enjoy throwing curveballs our way. Had Sultan Murad I lived, it is very possible he could have had a hand in averting the military disaster that is waiting for the Ottomans under his reckless son Bayezid I. Even though 70 was considered an old age to live to back in those days, all indications were that Murad was in excellent health and had maybe at least another 10 years in him. But who's to say? All we can say is that this great sultan left behind fire that took a man 42 days to cross the entirety of it, whereas when he first ascended the throne, it took a man a mere 3 days. Murad carried on the vision left behind by Osman and Orhan of steady, careful expansion, never too fast and always in good order. He set the foundations of a government that was to last over 500 years. By abandoning the traditions of putting one's family in places of power and importance. Instead, Murad created a system that rooted out boys of talent and intelligence and formed them into young men through martial training, philosophy, art, and pride of state, and then put these talented men into positions of power. He thus implemented a system of giving local commanders like Lalu the power to act independently, which created a command and control system that was both decentralized when it needed to be and centralized for major campaigns. This would prove a lifesaver, as the local commander could more effectively respond to the ever-fluid political, military, and economic environment that confronted the empire at its frontiers. Murad also worked to ensure the Christians in his empire would have a place and always restrain policies and personalities that sought to molest them. It is said that the Ottomans during this time treated their Christian populations better than Christian rulers treated their own people. The Sultan, in the grand vision of Ottoman, had always sought the best ideals of Rome, and that he welcomed the subjects of conquered peoples to join Ottoman society as fully equals. As far as medieval rulers go, the Ottomans could have done much worse. I'd like to take a few seconds and thank the many wonderful listeners of the show. After receiving new reviews on Apple Podcasts, I'd like to reach out and personally thank Tim O'Brien over at Shaping Opinion Podcast for his thoughtful input. I took a moment to check in at Tim's podcast, and I have to say, it's very engaging and informative, covering a wide variety of topics. Tim, if you're listening, I don't know where you find your guests, but please find more of them. I surely enjoyed your expertise. I'm sure Tim would appreciate it too if you guys stopped by. You can find Tim by going to Apple Podcasts and typing Shaping Opinions Podcast. Speaking of supporting podcasters, I'd like to bring up the number 323. Depending on how you look at it, it's a small number if we're talking about your bank account, or a very large number if we're talking about years in prison. In terms of podcast subscribers, listeners, and downloads, some might fit this number in the small category. But for me personally, 323 is an awesome number. Judging from the emails I've received, downloads tracked in Apple Podcasts Analytics, then we have around that number of listeners. When I started Empires of History podcast, I figured one episode a week, and after a year I'd have 500 listeners if I were lucky. Since releasing episode 1 back in October of this year, we are well on track to beating my original goal. I never intended, and still don't, for the podcast to be anything else but a cool way to vent my love of history and hopefully make a few dozen or so drives home for other people a little less tedious. So I'd like to thank you. Thank you for your wonderful emails and for the fine reviews. I really appreciate it. And the hit of dopamine I get when a review pops up is quite addictive, I must say. And on that note, I've made the decision to thank you guys in more ways than just words. For some time now, I've been toying with the idea of offering something special to my listeners. It will still be free, no need to pay anything, but just a little extra on top of the weekly episode. So next week, be on the lookout for a very special edition of Empires of History podcast, in addition to your regular program. All I can say is that it will involve an interview with a very informative historian. With all that said, you can find the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify, and by visiting the show's website at, all one word, empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Feel like supporting the show? You can always leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. Or if you're feeling really generous, you can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, please drop me a line at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time we begin the tale of Sultan Bayezid I. I hope you will join me. Many thanks.